possibilities. For example, one of the key things that I always liked is synchronicity. 1963, which is when our project kind of really got off the ground, was the date that Rachel Carson published her book called
Silent
Spring, which is generally considered the beginning of the American environmental movement. And that book, that title expresses a consciousness expanding experience, because you hear the word silent spring and you think, why? Why is the spring silent?
Yeah.
Why aren't the birds singing? Why aren't the insects sounding? What's going on? And that questioning then leads you to search into and look at the hidden dynamics of the pollution and the chemical, not that didn't involve drugs, you see, but it was and that's what I call divination. It's a question. Divination is you ask yourself a question and you get an answer from sources within yourself. So when you say the phrase, I ask myself, that question implies that you believe that there is something in you that knows more than you do. Otherwise, why would you be asking? And it makes you receptive to your higher self, to your intuition, to your wise self, you see. And then you think, oh, well, I asked myself, what's going on in this situation? And the environmentalists say, there's a strong connection. Many psychedelic people got first inspired to take psychedelics and then got inspired to an environmental movement. Because you expand consciousness, you look around, you say, well, we don't want to be doing that. We don't want to be, eating food that's degraded and, treated with chemical fertilizer. We don't want to be polluting the water and the air and, all of that kind of thing. So we want to make changes. So all those movements represent, and the women's liberation, that was like, they called it even consciousness raising.
Yeah.
So women got together in groups and said, well, who are we and what do we want apart from being somebody's wife, mother, sister, secretary, or mistress, and what are our needs and what are our identities, and how do we work together? It's not anti-men or anything like that, but it is questioning the previous assumptions. See, in the same way that I like the concept of counterculture, but it's only part of the story. To be anti-war, okay, yes, you have to be anti the war machine, but what's the point? The point is in order to be able to live together in peace,
Yes,
you see.
yes.
And
But there are those that want to know what happened to that
Right.
urge for social consciousness, for the
Right.
transformation.
Right.
Has it gone underground? I always love that
Right.
story about they used to give Nixon a very hard time for belonging to an all-white golf club, and he
Right.
said, well, I'm going to change it from inside.
Mhm.
So what has happened to that impulse? What's happened to
Well,
social transformation?
I think the impulse remained, but the particular modalities of taking, this unusual class of drugs, of course, that went completely underground because it became illegal, which means that you can't use it, not because it was harmful. So, twice in my life now, in the 60s with LSD and in the 80s again with MDMA or ecstasy, I've been in a situation of, as a psychotherapist, working with tools and then all of a sudden finding that I would be a felon if I continued doing it. Not because somebody was harmed or complained or damage was done. No, not quite the contrary. People were not complaining at all. They were saying, we're reporting really good results, you see. But because decisions were made at another level. And then we have this thing called a drug war. That has nothing to do with science. It has nothing to do with medicine or healing or anything like that. That has no scientific basis, no rationale other than, and it's not even primarily about psychedelic drugs. There's a very small percentage. It's all about heroin and cocaine and the uncounted billions and millions of dollars that involved, that slosh through the kind of global economy around those drugs and marijuana to a certain extent. But everyone is caught up in, and that has nothing to do with social change or social benefit either. You don't pass laws against drugs. I mean, laws are for behavior, not about substances. You see, you can make behavior illegal, and of course it should be illegal to give drugs to people without their consent, and of course it should be illegal to take drugs and drive, and just as it's illegal to give alcohol to somebody without their consent and underage, or to drive. And we have plenty of laws. We don't need to pass a law against alcohol, in fact. But and of course, all these things need to be regulated. In fact, I think alcohol should be regulated more than it is.
Well,
People should be required to pass a course, an education test, just like you do for a driving test, to recognize what are the dangers of alcohol drinking and addiction and what's involved and what it does to your body and all of that kind of thing, and what the treatment modalities are before being given a license to be able to buy alcohol. So regulation, rational regulation regulation as a public health issue, and drug use is not going to go away, and drug abuse is not going to go away, but you minimize the harm. Harm reduction is the policy that's pursued by most European countries now. The United States is regressive in that regard in terms of passing progressive legislation.
Well, I want to talk about another kind of progress, because in your work and in this book, The Birth of a Psychedelic Culture, you can just see the beginning of the trajectory of your thought in your lifelong study of the transformation of consciousness.
Right.
But you have taken many, many old, ancient ideas, and you have kind of made a convergence with them of contemporary science.
Right.
And will you tell us a little about what is the Metzner alchemical divination process,
Right.
and then also a little bit about the Green Earth Foundation.
Right, and the California Institute of Integral Studies,
Yes.
which used to be called the Institute of Asian Studies, was founded by an Asian philosopher. And one of the things that happened in the 60s that people gravitated toward the East, as we did with the Psychedelic Experience book, and based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and looking for guidance in Eastern philosophies and in shamanism. For many years, I taught at the Institute of Integral Studies East-West psychology. I taught states of consciousness, looking at all kinds of states of consciousness, drug-induced and ordinary states like dreaming, sleeping, waking. Those are ordinary states of consciousness we all have all the time. They're profoundly altered, and completely different reality, completely different mind space and time stream. Each state of consciousness has its own space, its own time. That's quite different from other states, from the ordinary functional state that we're in when we're functioning like we are now, which is also a state of consciousness.
Yeah.
So that's closely tied to sort of time space, and so then I got so involved in, and I wrote books, The Unfolding Self, for example, which looks at metaphors of transformation in different cultural Eastern and Western traditions, and how do people talk about transformations of consciousness. And then I got very much involved in looking at ancient traditions of shamanism and how they're reflected in the mythology. In my own country, since I'm from European, the shamanic traditions are no longer alive. It's kept in a very small way.
But they're really
But you have the
classical,
mythology. You have the
yeah.
mythology. So in the Well of Remembrance, I talk about the shamanic mythology of the old Europeans. So, and then green psychology, I talk about how psychology would change if you take an ecological point of view into account, which it obviously needs to. And people like Ted Rozak have written about eco-psychology, for example, and I call it green psychology. So the idea was that I've come to see that shamanism, yoga, and alchemy as being traditional systems of transformation, with shamanism the oldest, and then yoga and alchemy being kind of the Eastern and Western kind of extensions of it. And transformation at every level, including healing, physical, emotional, psychological, what we would call psychological therapy, and then spiritual, which we would call religious, spiritual kind of transformation. They were, and in the East they were more accepted, whereas in the West alchemy came into conflict with the church, because the church had a sort of stranglehold control on religious ideology and thinking, and didn't approve of anything that involved religious experience. So the alchemists had to disguise everything. It became completely an underground tradition, all disguised in this weird symbolism where people thought it was just gibberish. Gibberish, the term gibber is actually the name of an Arabic alchemist called Geber.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
So it's an archetype of gibberish. But they disguised it as on purpose, because but there was basically shamanism.
Well, the secret protects itself. They
yes,
had
the
to
secret
build
protects
it.
itself.
Yeah.
And but they were into healing. They were into healing. Paracelsus was a healing, and psychological and spiritual practices. They are yogic psychological practice, which Jung rediscovered. And in my book, Expansion of Consciousness, I talk about the history, how Jung rediscovered the language of alchemy. And he said, this is the language of the psyche, the psychological language of psychological transformation.
And the metaphor, because the alchemist wants to turn base metal into gold, is also the metaphor for the spiritual quest.
Exactly, transforming negative states of consciousness, on a metaphorical level, negative states of consciousness into more enlightened, or as the yogis would say, enlightened or liberated states of consciousness. And of course, but it's true at every level. So it's true at the at the physical level as well as the mental, and they would explicitly make the connections. Whereas Western science has developed with a complete separation between the physical dimension and all the other dimensions, because that's a historical accident. It's not true, because we are in fact multidimensional beings. We have the physical and the mental and emotional and spiritual dimensions. So to separate them like that is not true. It's false. It gives false results and misleading results. So, and historically, I think, and the use of the psychedelic substances will maybe contribute and to a re-evaluation of that disconnect, and among other things. And in that sense, because, for example, a study was done by Charles Grove where he interviewed Buddhist meditators and teachers of meditation who'd been teaching for 20 years, dedicated practitioner. And he asked them, what role do psychedelic experiences play in your practice, in your history? And they all said, well, it doesn't play any role now, but it played a very significant role at the beginning. Because at the beginning, these experiences gave me a sense of what I was aiming for, what the possibilities were.
A map for the journey.
Yeah, a preview of coming attractions. But then I saw, well, there's no point taking the preview over and over. You want to get to the main event and find out how to change your thinking and your practice and your psychological life, and learn mindfulness. Learn consciousness in everyday life, and consciousness while you're eating and while you're walking and while you're talking and while you're living in your family and doing your job and all of that kind of thing. And so there's a strong tie-in, just like there can be a tie-in of psychedelic drugs to medicine and psychotherapy, there can be a tie-in to psychological spiritual practices.
And Dr. Metzner, we have been at the intersection of the timeless with time, but we have a limited amount of time for this program. And thank you for opening the doors of perception for us and showing us. I do hope you will come back and do another show with us.
I'd be happy to. Thank you.
Our guest today is Dr. Ralph Metzner, whose new book, this is a wonderful read, it's called The Birth of a Psychedelic Culture. Another one that does his alchemical divination project. Fascinating reading. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome.
And I'd like to
Glad to
thank
do it.
you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by a grant from New Mexico Tech on the frontier of science and engineering education for bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees. New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH. And by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.